Thank you for joining us today for our peer networking group for peer support supervisors. We have Lydia here with Youth Move National who's going to join us. I have a couple just housekeeping organizational things that we want to go through first. Just in case there are any security problems during this session, we will pretty much just end the session immediately. We will not resume using the same link. We will send out a separate email to everyone with further instructions. So fingers crossed we don't have any problems like that today. I'll go to the next slide now here. So this is just a short disclaimer that this presentation was prepared under NTAC. It is not directly from SAMHSA, although we are funded by them to do this work. We're going to go to the next slide now. Perfect. So the purpose of our peer support supervisor affinity group is pretty much to convene and to create a peer network for those who support and supervise youth and or peer parent support providers and who want to foster and support this unique workforce in supervision strategies, agents practice, and with community partners. Today, we're going to be talking about things that are specific to youth peer support and hoping to give you guys a few tips with that. I'm going to go to the next slide now. This is just a reminder. We'll also talk about this a little bit at the end. Save the date. It's our big system of care, children's mental health awareness conference coming up on May 10th. It's going to be all virtual. So we hope that you guys will be able to join us for that. The full one for everybody, all children's mental health advocates, system of care grantees, those with lived experience, that's going to be held on May 11th. So please join us. We're going to be promoting this. I'm sure you guys will hear about it a few more times. I'm going to go to the next slide now. Joshua was not able to make it with us today, but we do have Lydia, and I'm going to turn the time over to them at this time.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Hi, my name is Lydia Proulx. I use they, them pronouns. I'm in Worcester, Massachusetts, up in the Northeast here. And so I'm a youth program coordinator at Youth Move National. I've been with Youth Move National about 5 years. I'm really excited to be doing anything related to youth peer support. My background is with our local chapter in Massachusetts, where there's a lot of recreational activities and very low barrier youth peer support available to young people from any lived experience background or systems involvement. So very fortunate to have that experience with a lot of different young people with a lot of different backgrounds. I'm sorry that Joshua couldn't make it today. He is terrific as well, and I love working with him. Today, we're gonna talk about trauma-informed principles and supervision, just like a quick recap. I'm a little new to your group, so just wanna sort of make sure that I'm using the same language and stuff as everyone. And then we're gonna talk about affirming space for LGBTQ peers. There should be a T in that. We were gonna break it out, but then we didn't. We're going to talk about gender identity and expression, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Youth Move Change Initiative and how you can really start to bring like this intersectional understanding into your supervision of youth peers and how to kind of train up and start thinking with this specific lens. And then at the end, we've got some small groups and scenarios to practice with and then debrief. All right, so diving right in, right? We know that trauma-informed care and trauma-informed principles are, to say the least, very super important to our work. I wanted to offer a couple reminders here. These slides were developed by Tony Donnelly, who's a phenomenal parent, peer provider, and subject matter expert over at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. And so I've borrowed some slides from her because I think they're just terrific and speak to both certified peer specialists for parents as well as young people. So peers and trauma in the workplace, right? Peers, both youth peers and parent peers, as well as individual consumer peers, right, have a very unique relationship with trauma. That is systems trauma within behavioral health care, child welfare, juvenile legal systems. There's also a lot of cultural implications that come along with that. We wanted to sort of affirm that the supervisor who's aware of this trauma and aware of this unique relationship, right, will recognize and seek to understand that young person or that parent's, right, unique story and the meanings that they've attached to their lived experience and stories. We need to remember that when we hire someone because of their personal experience, then the job is personal, right? There's a level of awareness and sort of just vulnerability we are asking folks to bring with them into work every day. We want to identify how peers can be triggered by everyday events, conversations, connections, and really understand that some of these triggers may have little to do with the families or the young people they're working with, and everything to do with other staff and organizational culture. So this is not just about, right, bringing peers in and sort of training them up. We've also got to make sure that we are using this really cool opportunity of peer support becoming more and more common in the workforce to really shift our staff, our teams, our organizational culture towards one of, you know, youth and parent and family voice really integrated throughout the work. When we're thinking of a trauma-informed approach from within supervision, right, these are some things we consider moving away from and moving towards within those practices. And at the bottom, you'll see that across this, right, again, are our trauma-informed principles. So moving away from mistrust and alienation, for example, and towards trust and connection can't happen without our 6 principles in place, right? So knowing that we want to move from the sort of peers on the outside and really bringing in and understanding and valuing that lived experience and support. All right. So as a little warm up, I'd like to invite you to drop into the chat box for us. How do you think, or how does systems-based trauma affect young people? Want to consider those 6 principles. Some examples might be turnover can make it hard to trust providers or agencies, right? If a young person's coming up through the mental health system, maybe they've had a lot of providers who weren't there for the long haul, right? A space may not be affirming for LGBTQ young people, or sorry, it may be affirming for LGBTQ young people, but not accessible for mobility aids. So this is really a lack of that gender and historical issues, right? How disabled folks are kept out of spaces either physically or because of other accommodations needed. Youth of color may have had provider teams who are mostly or all white, and this might relate to our principle of safety and again, gender and historical issues. So let's drop some other thoughts into the chat. I'm seeing Brandy offering that foster care, group homes could absolutely be a point of trauma for youth involved in different systems. What else? Affects health, absolutely. And we know that adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, as well as just ongoing stress, right, can really affect our health. I think many of us may be able to speak to that, especially over the last few years. What else? Michelle's offering that young people within the foster system are often regulated to an ineffective level due to liability concerns of the state. Absolutely. So there's limitations at state and also federal levels for systems youth involvement. Deborah's offering that sometimes we think one person speaks for many. Absolutely. While the young person and youth's perspectives are vital and important, right? One young person's lived experience is their lived experience, right? We need to be hearing from a multitude of voices. Marianne's offering that many times young people see the clinicians and case managers as aligned with parents or with than caregivers, right? So understanding that sometimes, even though we say that a treatment approach is youth-centered or client-centered, maybe there's more alignment, maybe they've experienced that it wasn't as youth-centered as it needed to be. Maybe their family and caregiver's voice was prioritized. All right. So when we're supporting, oh, yep, I'm seeing youth justice system, right? Probation, absolutely. When we're considering trauma and employing and supervising peers in the workforce, we need to really be aware of all these linkages from the lived experience that we are asking them to bring into the space and share regularly, and for us to learn from, right? The linkages between that lived experience and these traumas that could be reactivated within the workplace just by the virtue of the work, right? Just by how sharing our lived experience can sometimes be reactivating. We have some quotations sort of sprinkled throughout when we've been talking to some of our youth move members and different focus groups. We'll talk later about the YMCI project. The one young person shared that there's always the chance at a new program or with a new staff, they're going to treat me worse or different. I always have to be thinking about my safety with every person I meet. That is a lot of people, right? And so remembering that young people, including the youth peer providers we're working with, are often moving through space and trying to assess their safety all the time. And we can make that a little bit maybe easier or build a connection that can support their well-being through that by being trauma-informed supervisors and really understanding the needs of the young people we are working with. And so one way we want to honor that, right, is this piece around gender identity. We're going to go through some vocabulary as well as some tools and like visualizations of what gender might be. I am a very interactive presenter. I know this is being recorded, so please feel free to put questions in the chat. Try to answer them as I go. And for my supporters off screen, if you can just help me make sure that we do answer all the questions that come through the chat. I want to make sure that y'all feel leaving like you got your questions answered. That said, there's a lot of space here for learning. If you're not sure about the language you're using to ask the question, I would absolutely prefer that you ask the question, and then we can have a learning moment around language or around the content of that question. So please, if you don't feel like putting it in the chat to everyone, you could certainly DM me or DM another host, and we can ask the question anonymously as well. That said, some vocabulary, right? These are words that you may or may not have seen around lately. The first one being cisgender. When someone is cisgender, they identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. Cis is Latin for on the same side of. So if you can think of a line, right? If someone is transgender, they've crossed this line. If someone is cisgender, they've stayed on the same side of this line, right? And so cisgender is simply anyone who isn't transgender. Transgender folks, this is an umbrella term, so there's a lot of different words that fit within this umbrella, but transgender describes people whose gender identity does not match what they were assigned at birth. Non-binary, again, is another umbrella term. We're having a lot more words come out describing gender that may be non-binary, but non-binary really encapsulate gender identities that are outside the binary. So they're not men or women, male, female. They're all or both or nothing, or they're sort of, I sometimes joke that my gender is like this non-committal hand gesture, like, yeah, well, you know, whatever. So they're kind of non-binary, right? They're like off the spectrum that we may have in our heads. Agender is when people don't identify with having a gender at all. It's not a concept or a feeling that they relate to. Agender. Gender nonconforming, sometimes you'll see this shortened as GNC, like trans and GNC folks. Gender nonconforming just means that that person's not conforming, not following those societal expectations around gender. Maybe their hobbies, their dress, their mannerisms, whether or not they've chosen to use hormones or anything, right? Those could all be parts of a gender nonconforming person's experience. The last two here are usually shared as acronyms, AMAB and AFAB. You might see a C at the front of them, so I shared that in parentheses. Coercively assigned male at birth, this is when a baby is born, right? And based on metrics and sort of like guidelines, right? The doctor says, this baby's a boy. That baby's been assigned male at birth, right? Similarly, on the flip side, right, coercively assigned female at birth, the baby's born, due to metrics and things, the doctor says, this baby's a girl, and that baby's been assigned female at birth. At the bottom of these, you have two clickable links in your PDF. The first is the glossary from Stonewall, the Stonewall organization in the UK, which is really helpful. The other one that I've included is from GLAAD, which includes a glossary of what not to say. So if you have a word that you've heard and you're like, oh, that word's been around a while, I wonder if that's still kind of in the lexicon, you can click on this link and GLAAD will tell you what the words are that we're using, what they mean, and then also there's a glossary of words that are outdated, offensive, and not appropriate to be using anymore. Are there any quick questions on this before we delve into a couple of these concepts a little further? All right.
Lydia, are you able to put that link in the chat?
I am.
Thank you.
You got it. One moment. See, we have another question in the chat. When you say I identify with the pronouns they, them, can you give examples on the way it's used? Mark, this is such a good question. We actually have a whole matrix of pronouns coming up. So I'm going to return to this question if it does not get answered when we see the big chart, but you're definitely on the right track where we're headed. So the first thing to bring up just about language, right, is sex assigned at birth. This used to be what we would call biological sex. We don't use the phrase biological sex anymore because biology and sex is very complicated. There are not just two options, especially within mammals and other animals, right? So we're not using the phrase biological sex anymore, understanding that sex is also a social construct, right? So we're saying sex assigned at birth. What sex was this baby assigned at birth? Scarlet Teen, which is a phenomenal sexuality and gender education website, especially for young people. If any of you need that resource, defines it as a way people, animals, or plants are classified based on their chromosomes, genitals, reproductive organs. So this is really about body parts and what doctors see when babies are born. The reason why I'm bringing this up specifically is I want you all to think about in terms of like welcoming certified peer specialists or youth peer providers, right? Have we evaluated our practices and policies to reflect what we want to know versus what we need to know regarding sex assigned at birth? An example of this might be a youth group has a form, for intake, right? Just like name, contact info, all that good stuff. And this is a community-based youth group, right? It runs, next door to the YMCA. It's not a clinic offering any medical or health services beyond recreational community-based peer connection. They may be asking, well, what's your sex, M or F, right? Select one. I think unless that group's offering like some kind of health service or, sexual reproductive services, they may not actually need to know what sex someone was assigned at birth, right? A more useful question might be, what pronouns do you use, right? So that when you're in this space, I can affirm and respect you the way that you wish to be affirmed and respected. Other examples include like, we've had field trip permission slips come home where folks have to fill out all the information, asking for, gender and then saying male or female, right? I don't know how that might be used on a field trip to Six Flags or anything. So really thinking about our practices, our policies, what do we want to know versus what do we need to know? Are we asking this question out of habit because that's the way it's been done so long? Or are there more useful things that we could be asking instead or alongside of? All right. So again, in the chat, I'd love to hear from y'all. What do you think gender is? How do you experience gender day to day? What do you think gender is? How do you experience gender? Kind of a weird question, kind of move through the world not thinking about it maybe every day. Michelle's offering that there's social constructs, there's a lot of unspoken rules around what gender is or how we are supposed to experience it. Big air quotes around supposed to. What else? How a person identifies, absolutely. Right? There's this assumption when someone says Mr. or Mrs. I've been to conferences where there haven't been gender neutral prefixes, so I select doctor because it's the only gender neutral one on the list and it's a required question. Got to be thinking about all the folks that may be in the room. How about one more? Either what you think gender is or how do you experience gender? Emily's offering that gender is more fluid than what we're taught in society. Masculinity and femininity exist in everyone. Exactly. This is all a lot more complicated than we have been led to believe for many years. And we're at a very exciting point where particular young people, but also this whole movement of transgender, gender nonconforming folks really pushing for this understanding of gender exploration and affirmation. So gender, just like Sharia added in the chat, is how one relates to and understands their gender, right? This is how someone identifies. This is their own personal connection to masculinity, femininity, the ideas of men, women, male, female. It's self-identified. It's not black and white. So like Emily said, right, it's fluid. There's a lot of gray space. There's assignment versus identification, right? We talked about this. There's sex assigned at birth, and then there's the person's identification. Some folks, again, are agender, right? Do not identify as having a gender at all. They move through the world not feeling connected to or called to either of those terms, or identifying as more masculine or feminine than the other, right? Gender identity can change over time. We're hearing a lot right now, in particular around folks who, particularly young people, if they were to identify as transgender, what if they grow up and that changes? A lot of things happen when we grow up and change. I'm not 8 pounds anymore, right? I can talk, I have a different haircut. You know, I have different hobbies, interests than when I was a small child. Lots of things about us change as we grow and learn more about ourselves and about our environment and our world around us. Totally normal and like kind of exciting that gender can shift over time. And there's no right or wrong way to have a gender identity. It's subjective to every person. There's a lot of conversation around what words are under the trans umbrella, which ones aren't. There's no right or wrong way to do it, particularly for young people who are exploring their gender identity and getting comfortable figuring out who they are and how they want to be affirmed and validated as they move through the world. Gender expression is how we show our gender to the outside world, how we express it. So that might be through our clothing, our makeup, our hairstyle. That could be through our speech. That might be through things such as hormones or surgeries, medical transition, right? Gender expression encompasses all of those things that we use to communicate our masculinity and femininity, whatever those might be. It's not the identity itself. Sometimes I compare these things to like Legos. You can have one Lego for your gender identity and one for your expression and then one for your sexuality, and you can break them down and build new things up. These are all sort of their own thing. They're not contingent on one another. And your gender expression can be related to your gender, but it does not define it. There are plenty of folks who identify as more masculine or as men and really love to wear dresses or skirts. And they're still men because that is their gender identity, and their expression is, I like to wear the skirt, I like feminine things, but I'm a man who likes feminine things, right? So we're using both in tandem to describe ourselves to the outside world and how we're going to hold ourselves in our own hearts. When we visualize gender, this is sort of the 101 visualization we like to offer, right? So it is on a spectrum. For identity, right, to the left, we see man, in the middle, this non-binary piece, and then woman on the other side. In the middle, you might also hear words like bigender, someone who identifies as both a man and a woman. You might also hear words, especially if you're working with Indigenous young people, such as two-spirit. Two-spirit is a gender identity. It's not really something we can put on this spectrum, since the spectrum is like a Western colonizer's idea of how gender works. But two-spirit is a word you may hear to kind of describe someone's gender that encompasses masculinity, femininity, an identity such as a man and a woman, but again, can be individual to that young person. And then below this, right, we also see gender expression. So to the left, again, masculine, to the right, feminine, and in the middle, this androgynous piece, maybe a little bit of both, maybe none of either, etc. So this is kind of like how many folks will think of this as we're beginning to understand the more complex and nuanced parts around gender identity. This is a chart from Northwestern University's impact program, where they work with a lot of LGBTQ folks, particularly students and those in the community. This is maybe a little closer to how we could describe gender on paper. Many folks, when you ask, would just sort of draw a big scribble on the paper and be like, this is gender. But this is kind of how we might start mapping it, right? The blue circles and connections to the left being more masculine or identifying more with masculinity, to the right, the same with femininity. In the middle, we have this yellow and orange sections, which are really talking about gender nonconforming, gender queer, androgynous folks. Darker orange has some more specific words. Our green ones up here might be identities that are neither of them. They may not fit on the spectrum we just looked at all. And so that's why we really like this chart as well, to kind of help us visualize how things are a little more all over the place than on a simple line. All right, Mark, here's the piece about pronouns coming up. So when we think about pronouns, right, we would say someone uses a particular set of pronouns. For example, my name is Lydia, I use they, them pronouns. Anyone of any gender identity can use any set of pronouns. Again, think Lego blocks, they're not contingent on one another. If you do not remember fourth grade grammar, this is a very grammatical chart, but it's useful for practicing. I'm also going to put in the chat, once I double check that it's still a good link, minus18.org is from out of Australia, and they have like flashcards and games you can play online to practice using different gender pronouns in sentences and in situations. And so that's a really, if you're kind of nervous about using they, them, when in our minds very often we use they, them for multiple people, if your brain's kind of tripping up over this switch, you can practice a little bit. Same with pronouns such as ze, here, here's, yourselves, yourself. You can also Google if you hear a set of pronouns like ze and you're not sure how to pronounce it. If you Google how to pronounce blank pronoun, there's tons of tutorials that come up that are just clips of how to pronounce it. So please feel free to explore, figure out, your comfortability, practice using them in sentences. It can be a little tricky. Our brains can be stubborn because remembering things is very important. But as we adjust habits and adjust our language, you'll get there. Say, okay. Yeah, flashcards are a big win for me too. Lots of practice beforehand. The Trans Student Educational Resources is a great website. They have a lot of things about gender and how it relates to sexuality and attraction. So if you are looking for some more information about how these things all link together, they make some really wonderful infographics that you can use around your office. They also have a lot of reports and resources that could be valuable as well. All right, so our takeaways about gender, right? Number one is a person is still transgender if they use their birth name and or given pronouns. So I'm someone who would identify as transgender. I still use my birth name. Had it, I like it, it's a family name, I choose to keep it. Folks may also select their own name, different set of pronouns, but transgender identity is about how they feel, how they relate, it's coming from within them. So even if they're using a given name and given pronouns, still transgender if they say they're transgender. Second, a person is still transgender if they don't correct a pronoun slip others make. So for many of us who are part of any marginalized community, a lot of days there are just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or more microaggressions or slip ups. And it can be tiring to have to correct and be on about it all the time. And sometimes we just let things go. It doesn't mean that we're not trans, it doesn't mean that we don't care. It means that maybe we're a little tired. Maybe right now isn't the safest place or time to address it, those sorts of things. So keeping in mind that even if someone doesn't always correct or isn't adamant about it a certain day, they're still trans. Person is still transgender if they only started questioning their gender or identity after reading about it in an article or on social media. This is why we make, we write articles and we produce social media content, is so that other folks can learn and hear new things and engage, right? So for young people in particular, sometimes receive a lot of pushback if after a particular TV show they watch or after hanging out with maybe some trans or GNC friends, they start to think like, well, maybe I'm trans or, gonna be a little less conforming to gender as well. Sometimes they receive criticism like, well, you're only doing this because ABC. Well, yeah, we all encounter things in our lives that cause us to explore things about ourselves or try something new or, think of something in a different way. That's how our environment is supposed to affect us. So leaving some room for those folks. And number 4, a person's still transgender if they choose not to pursue any hormone therapy, medical transitions, surgeries, other medical support. There are trans folks who very much want and need these affirmative medical supports. They can be life-saving. There are lots of trans folks who do not want to pursue any kind of hormone therapy or medical transition support for a variety of reasons. One might be cost, one might be insurance, one might be current health risks and those, what kind of risks that sets them up for. Some folks might have mental health needs or on medicine that wouldn't interact well with hormone therapy, right? So lots of different reasons. There's also trans folks who are just perfectly content with their bodies as is and don't experience dysphoria in that way. And so they wouldn't pursue those things. A-okay, still trans. All right. Before we jump into our next Let's Chat, I just want to pause for a moment to see if there are any questions that come up in the chat. Mark, was your question about pronouns earlier answered? If not, please drop it again. So looking for examples, yeah. So I use they, them pronouns. Examples of how it might be used would be Lydia went to the store, they bought some oranges, Michelle, Michelle's dog, oh, that's about Peaches, that's a little silly. Michelle has a dog named Peaches who I'm obsessed with. Lydia works for Youth Move National. They are a youth program coordinator. Can take a little getting used to, but certainly we use they as a singular pronoun all the time in our speech. Yes, it is in the third person. It'll sound similar to, oh, well, the electrician called, oh, what did they say, right? Or, the new teacher at school assigned way too much homework the first night. Oh my gosh, what homework did they send you home with, right? When we don't know someone's gender in a story, we often use the singular they without realizing it, but it can still certainly be a little uncomfortable to intentionally switch to that third person kind of grammar when we are using it. But it's in the dictionary. It's been used since 1700s English, at least as a singular pronoun, even before that as well, before it was out of style. Now it's in style again. Language is funky like that, and it does take some practice and shifting, but it can make a world of difference, particularly for young people. Can I talk a little bit about those who use she, them, or he, them pronouns a little bit? Absolutely. So you might see folks in their email signatures, or they might say they use she, them. When folks share two different sets of pronouns with you, more than likely, or not uncommonly, many of those folks are saying, please use both and switch them up. This can be for a variety of reasons. Many folks, particularly those who, for example, use she, them, if we only use she for them, we might not be affirming that non-binary or gender non-conforming part of their spirit, right? And if we only use they, them, maybe we're not affirming the femininity that they want people to see within them or people to honor. So we want to make sure that best we can, we are sort of using both pronouns and not being afraid to kind of honor both sides of that conversation. Again, can be tricky, takes a little practice, but certainly can make, again, a world of difference, just how someone feels seen and is heard, particularly in the workplace. We know that we want peers to be feeling as though they belong and that they are valuable parts of the team, because they are. So we want to make sure we're doing the best we can to retain folks, particularly those who may be trans or gender nonconforming. All right. So in the chat, again, what are some examples of how gender has influenced your field, your job, or your organization? Maybe what kind of barriers or challenges come up as a result of gender's influence on that space? So how has gender influenced your field, your job, or your organization? How many of you are social workers or clinicians, maybe working in, okay, great. So Deborah's adding, people are more open. Deborah, could you tell me a little bit more what you mean by that, either in the chat or off mute? How are people more open?
I think it's just that they feel that there's a little more freedom of expression?
Absolutely. So if we know that these options exist and these opportunities for exploring gender exist, we may take them more often, especially if other folks begin to take them as well and explore. Thank you. Michelle offers, in social work, we often see men rise to leadership positions despite there being more women in the field. Absolutely. This is something we commonly see across many fields that are dominated typically by women, but men tend to have the majority of leadership positions. And so we know that gender is at work there in some ways. Makes people feel more comfortable. Absolutely. If we're open to gender identity being a person's own experience, we may be making folks feel more comfortable. Marianne's offering in parents a parent peer support. It's highly women populated, parent peer support. Caregivers who apply for jobs with us are more often mothers than fathers. I'd imagine that could be challenging if you have fathers looking for support and they want that peer connection. How can we be connecting more dads, more fathers to the work? Gender is definitely at work there. Parents can understand their kids better sometimes. Absolutely. If there's a shared gender identity, same with any shared identity, right, across two people, but particularly parents and their children, understanding may come a little more easy because we can imagine on our side what that might be like. Daniel's adding that we now require employees to include pronouns when ordering new business cards. Many people are upset about being forced to do so. Thoughts? I have a few thoughts. My first thought is that if folks are upset because they're being asked to think about their gender simply, I can understand why that's upsetting, right? Gender is something that's very innate to us. It's something that is part of the foundation of how we understand the world around us. When we're told to question that foundation, it can be pretty upsetting, whether or not because we don't understand or we don't think it's necessary, our foundation is fine as it is. I can understand how people would react that way. I think supporting with education, supporting with, again, going back to our trauma-informed principles, if we're going to be trauma-informed for the folks who walk through the door, this is part of that. This is part of affirming folks' gender and really addressing those gender and historical issues that come up as a result of this generational trauma. The other flip side you might hear is that some trans folks or non-binary folks are frustrated at having to share pronouns kind of as like a group exercise now. I would say in professional circles, this is less of a concern, where definitely sharing pronouns out in order to affirm and validate those identities around you who we may not be able to see right away, right? Sharing pronouns out in professional circles, particularly when you're service providers, is very important. Does that answer the question, Danielle? Is there another piece to it missing?
It gives me a little more insight, but I don't think there's like a definite answer to this question. I think it's, like you said, it's so personal for every individual.
Yeah.
So, it's just, I've gotten into a few conversations with people and it's like, just was hoping maybe you could give me some more insight on how to approach it. I personally just decided to do it because I felt like, it's not all about me. I'm in a helping profession, so
right.
It makes the person feel a little better. That's fine, but at the same time, I kind of understand their, why do I have to make someone else feel better? Why is that my job? So I don't know. I just was wondering if you had any, so yeah, that's fine.
Right. I think you said it right. We're in helping profession. We're here to support other folks. I think we can always ask, where's the discomfort coming from? Maybe we can address that. I think certainly going to the research that shows, when gender pronouns are affirmed and validated, and when youth can feel safe to share theirs, we see lower rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, self-harm. There's a lot of good research that points towards it being a best practice. And that might be one example where policy needs to lead culture change, right? There needs to be, we're going to do this because it's best practice, and we're going to shift that culture that way versus culturally everyone doing it and then it kind of becoming policy. But again, I think, that conversation, being open and curious. I would also recommend that folks who are trans are not the ones having those conversations with employees, right? That are not pleased with having to put their pronouns on, right? Making sure that that conversation is between cis folks so that they can support one another through that processing. I'll certainly dig around. I think I have some like guides to conversations, particularly for teachers, but the points may translate well. I'll double check, but GLSEN would be a good resource. Mark is saying that he needs to learn his pronoun again and how to speak it in a way that's comfortable to everyone. Absolutely, it is wild how our brains need the time to rewire. Katie offered that many individuals include pronouns in their email signature line or Zoom name, and it's very helpful. I do find it super helpful for particularly when I'm facilitating spaces to have pronouns in the pictures. In person, I do a little bit better picking up on names and pronouns as we go, but there's something about virtual connection that my brain just needs a couple extra helpful reminders. And so definitely can be super useful. Michelle's offering some experience here about this conversation. I've had that conversation regarding pronouns as well before. Why do we have to change to accommodate air quotes others? One effective way she's found to talk about this is to just explain this exists whether we acknowledge it or not. We're systematically changing how we do things, and it's going to be frustrating. This is absolutely true, right? Whenever systems have to shift, it's challenging. The folks you're working with, you yourselves, are very busy. There is a shortage of helping professionals across the country right now. We all have way too much on our plates. A major culture and habit shift is the last thing we probably want to be dealing with. And it is important and it is essential for the young people and their families who we're supporting who are LGBTQ. So thank you, Michelle. All right. From a youth mover who's 16 at the time of this conversation, staff will make excuses like, I don't know how to use that pronoun, or, well, your file says legal name. You're the professional here. Ask someone to teach you. You're here to help me. So help me, but show me respect too. I want help, but I need respect first. This is a big thing, right? If we're relationship building with young people and their families in order to encourage them to access support, to, try out new things to increase their wellness, we've got to be building trust. And if there isn't the trust to be able to use my correct name, my correct pronouns, the rest of this treatment plan is not going to go according to plan. We really have to be, again, adjusting our foundations and building up from there. Along those lines, we have some tips on just things you can do within your workplaces, within your own lives, to really offer that affirmation and validation to youth and families who walk through your door. This list is pretty long. I apologize that it's very text heavy. These are things that we've heard from youth movers, young people themselves. They're also things that we've heard through projects such as the Quality Improvement Center for LGBTQ youth in foster care. One thing to think about, right, again, similar to pronouns and business cards and in email signatures, or these other, we call them like secret handshakes, even if they're not very secret, but inclusive and thoughtful posters, flags, quotations in your marketings, in your physical spaces. How can we kind of be showing without saying that this is a space that you are welcome and that you're valued? Again, updating forms, considering what we need to know, what we want to know, inviting people to share names and pronouns, just as a normal part of introduction. Again, the word here is invite, right? So if folks are not feeling that they want to, particularly for trans folks who don't feel it's safe to be out at work or out in that particular meeting, invitation is a good idea. We're going to say pronouns, not preferred pronouns. Pronouns aren't a preference, they're just the thing the person uses. If you can, and as much as possible, update bathroom procedures or assign a gender-neutral restroom. If you are in a space that is education-based or community-based, the Massachusetts Department of Education, Secondary and Elementary Education will provide this as a resource, has a pretty robust policy on how to create spaces for young people to use bathrooms, locker rooms, and the takeaway is that the gender neutral restroom is there if folks are not comfortable being in a gendered space. So that includes trans folks who want a private space to change or use the restroom. This also includes cis folks who are not comfortable with trans folks in their bathroom. If you have a cis employee who is like, I don't want trans folks in my bathroom, okay, you can use the gender neutral bathroom. That's fine. There's a space for you too to feel safest. We want to consider how information and young people's data is collected and shared between your organization and home. Young people may very much be able and want to be out with their clinicians or with their community leaders and peers, but it is not safe or they are not ready to do so at home. How are you keeping information? How is it stored? Who has access to it? How do you know which names are going on permission slips home versus staying within the group? Things like that, really considering those policies and how you'll make that work. Using gender neutral language whenever needed instead of he or she saying they. So again, looking at policies, looking at marketing, people instead of men and women, etc. You could also split groups when you're doing activities or doing any kind of group-based work based on favorite foods instead of men or women, men and women, or boys and girls. You could ask folks if you prefer chocolate soft serve to vanilla soft serve, like these are the two groups, or if your favorite summer food is watermelon versus hot dogs, whatever those two things might be. It doesn't always have to be food, that's just a very easy example. And again, you want to ensure affirmation and validation includes this intersectional piece, right? That we're also affirming disabled young people from different class backgrounds, folks from different areas of town, different communities. We'll be talking a little bit more about this in the Youth Move Change Initiative next, but again, if your space is open and affirming for LGBTQ folks, it's got to be open and affirming for disabled LGBTQ folks and Black LGBTQ folks and LGBTQ folks from the global South, right? There's a lot of layers here to being an open and affirming organization. And when we talk about LGBTQ, sometimes we only think of sexuality and gender, but really, right, people are dynamic, complicated, nuanced. There's lots of layers to every individual, and we can't just choose which one of those things to be at each time, right? We're all of those things at once. Other strategies include supporting families and supportive adults in understanding. So practicing learning effective messaging and strategies for supporting families. They're going to be different than the messaging and the language you use with young people. The Family Acceptance Project out of San Francisco is an excellent resource for support for families. PFLAG is another. Parents, families, and supportive adults processing needs to be separate from the youth experience. Many times we'll hear young parents say like, well, I'm grieving the loss of my daughter if their son just came out, right? Or I'm grieving the loss of, my kid's not going to have the wedding I always dreamed of. These are real, like legitimate feelings of loss, of change, right? Parents should be supported in honoring those. Those are not appropriate feelings to share with the young person who is coming out to them. Because for the young person who's coming out, I'm still your kid. I'm still the exact same person. I've just got this different gender identity, or I'm using different pronouns. You haven't lost anyone. These two experiences don't mix well, and they can be really harmful for young people to hear that their parents are grieving them when they feel they're right there being their most truest self and doing this really brave thing. So that processing needs to be separate from the young person's experience. For staff, we want to provide ongoing training, not one-offs, and reinforce high expectations. This goes back to that quotation from the young person saying that like staff, we have to learn from one another. Like we've got to be the ones, providers have to be the ones to be learning, to be doing the work, putting in the time to understand and move this forward. Make sure you've got a feedback mechanism for young people and their families to offer feedback, support, input, especially regarding these changes as they do take some time in places. And we want to make sure that young people have a way to say, this would be more affirming, right? This would be supportive. This clinician misgendered me even after I said my pronouns are X, Y, Z, right? Or she or her. We want to make sure that young people have a way to air that grievance, to make sure it can be addressed, so that harm can be healed. And again, thinking about what we want to know versus what we need to know. All right. Real quick, how to apologize for using a wrong pronoun. Often when someone uses the wrong pronoun, I liken it to, have you ever slipped in public or tripped over the curb or the sidewalk and everyone keeps looking at you and saying, are you okay? Oh my God, are you okay? And then more people stop and they ask, are you okay? And it just becomes more embarrassing. Apologizing for using the wrong pronoun can be short, sweet, to the point. And doesn't have to sort of be this big emotional overhaul every time, like when we trip over the sidewalk. If the concern's brought to you, if someone says you misgendered me one-to-one, that person's talking to you one-to-one, thank them for saying something. Thanks so much for letting me know. I'm so glad you trusted me with this. Thank you. Acknowledge and apologize. I'm sorry, I did not use the correct pronoun. This is the thing I did wrong, right? And then we want to commit to doing better in the future and invite further feedback. So I'll be sure to use your correct pronouns in the future. If there's anything else I could do differently to make sure you're fully welcome in this space, please let me know. You're a value here. We want to make sure you feel safe. You are safe. Nice and easy. In a group conversation, right? You might get called in saying, oh, their pronouns are XYZ. If you're called on a group conversation, again, thank the speaker for that notice, make the correction and move on. Oh, right, thank you. Lydia went to the store, they bought some oranges, or let Avery know and she'll be able to, right? Thank you, restate with the correct pronoun. Later, briefly, in a one-to-one, like personal space, right? Commit to doing better in the future and invite feedback. Again, I'll be sure to use the right pronoun. This makes, you know, the connection that we're like bridging that connection specifically to the person whose pronoun we got wrong, but also sort of just makes it known that like you're trying, you're doing this work, and that you are someone who can support them and making sure other folks are addressing their pronouns and things, that you are there to support. Any questions about using a wrong pronoun or apologizing in that space? Or this is sort of the thing that we hear a lot of, I don't want to do this wrong kind of thing. Yes, Deborah, please jump in.
Can this apply as well when there's been a name change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I would say one-to-one, right? Similar thing. Oh, shoot, thank you so much for reminding me. I'll remember to use your correct, your correct name in the future, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Same thing in a group. Oh, right. Michelle went to the store. She bought some oranges. The simple sort of correction moving forward, and then in private, the recognition that like, I'll be sure to do that in the future. Thanks for calling me in on it. Keeping it short and sweet when it's in public, again, is like tripping in public, right? We don't want everyone to stop and stare. It just gets weird and uncomfortable. So just short, sweet, to the point in group conversations. Thank you so much. Yeah, name changes can also be tricky. I think Rosa has her hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back to what you stated in regards to when a parent does says they're grieving, the loss of their child or whatever. So I had a situation with a parent where they were grieving not the loss of their child per se. They accepted the child when they came out and everything, but then the child wanted to change his name, and it was hard, and they still have a hard time calling this child by the chosen name. And how is that a conversation that they can have to come to an understanding where the child knows that it's something that the parents are working on, but it's hard for them because they've given this name, and it's kind of a loss. But how do you approach that sensitively, but also respecting the fact that you don't want to crush this this kid who was so brave to come out to their parents and be just their amazing true self, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So if you can give me some advice, I would appreciate that for you.
Totally.
For next time.
It's a really, really good question. I think many people, and I say many because I cannot speak for all, right? But many people, when they see someone's making the effort, that they are, looking up the information they need, that they're practicing with the correct name and pronoun, that they get it right as much as they're able to, right? And they keep learning. I think that is what's most important during that transition. Certainly parents, I imagine many parents like had that name in their heads long before they had that baby, right? So this name is kind of like, it's really in there. Like our brains hold on to this information. There's surely some sentimental pieces going on there. I think trying again, being like, I'm working on it, I'll get it right, restarting with the correct name, demonstrating that you can and you will use it in a sentence. Many young people, the greatest fear is that parents or close loved ones will choose not to respect their pronouns or their name. It's one thing to choose not to respect someone's experience, but to make a mistake because our brains are relearning something is a little different, right? And so if that demonstration of respect is there, often the practice, the habit can come after. I would encourage parents to practice with their parent peer provider, or their clinician or a neighbor, practicing using the name in a sentence. The more we hear ourselves say something out loud, the easier it is to actually say it when it comes time to say it. So that practice in the meantime certainly can be useful. That doesn't mean that any of, the parent doesn't have to say, oh, I'm still grieving the loss of my daughter, blah, 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 whenever they make a mistake. Simply, shoot, I'm sorry, I'm working on it. So-and-so, using the correct name, I think is probably the way to go. There will be young people who, for whatever reason, right, whatever trauma, whatever sort of lived experience is informing it, are very hurt whenever there is a mistake made. And I think that there again, the demonstration of the work, that I'm someone you can trust, I want to be doing this well, I am working on it, is especially important to demonstrate in front of them, right? Not only be working on it behind the scenes. So that sort of public affirmation and effort is really important, and just keep trying. It is hard. It is not easy to switch pronouns. I mean, when friends come out and have new pronouns, I make mistakes. Like, it takes time for brains to readjust. It's not always an easy switch.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a tough dynamic, and largely folks need their own spaces with peers, parent peers, youth peers, to process, to work through it. Totally. So from our young people, this person was 15 during this conversation. Staff can help us by correcting others when they get our names or pronouns wrong. They should speak up and help other staff understand. When they don't speak up, it makes it seem like it's okay to call me by my old name or use the wrong pronouns. I've been in multiple situations, usually at residentials or hospital units where there's multiple staff and youth around, and there isn't this sort of peer correction, particularly between staff around someone uses an old name or incorrect pronouns, and we kind of just let it go. And the expectation has to be, even when that person isn't right in front of us, we're still showing them respect, particularly when we're working with folks who are healing, who are in places where maybe they're not choosing to be, they're not, don't have as much agency as usual, right? We want to be really honoring that growth and that healing, and we need to be doing that alongside each other, supporting that alongside each other, not just when that young person or that CPSY is right in front of us, that peer provider is right in front of us. It needs to be happening all the time. All right. So thinking more about this intersectional approach, right? We, this past year, have been working with the Youth Move Change Initiative. This was as a result of a grant from the Upswing Foundation, where we were able to run multiple peer provider trainings for BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and LGBTQ youth, in order to really hopefully infuse the workforce with some folks who have the lived experience of the young people that we are serving, right? We know that the peer workforce is largely white. We do in the youth peer workforce have many queer and trans folks, not exactly representing the same numbers as those in systems, but definitely closer, less of a disparity than folks of color. We know that rural versus urban young people are in systems where there aren't a reflection of their lived experience and their peer providers, lots of different things like this. The word we use to talk about looking at a situation, looking at a system, and seeing all these connections of identity and oppression and privilege, it's called an intersectional lens or intersectional perspective. Intersectionality is a framework that was coined by, developed by Kimberly Crenshaw out of New York in the 80s to describe specifically, she was talking about Black women's experiences, that Black women have this specific overlap of Black folks' experiences and women's experiences, and their needs and considerations are specific. And so this idea that Black women are not Black and women, they are Black women all the time, no matter what space they're occupying. And so similarly, our young people, our CPSYs, CPSPs, I've been in a different group lately, youth peer providers, parent peer providers, have multiple identities, right? And in order to be fully affirming of LGBTQ folks, we need to be fully affirming of folks of color, of Black folks, Indigenous young people, because they also have LGBTQ identities within their communities. Mark is adding in the chat that he hasn't you heard the word queer used a lot. Mark, do you mean in this conversation or in general? In this conversation. Right, so I will use the word queer to describe like the umbrella of LGBTQ folks sometimes. One reason, and this is a good example of intersectionality, right, that we don't use the word queer in large groups where I don't know folks, is that older LGBTQ folks have a very different relationship to that word than younger LGBTQ folks do. A former coworker of mine would recoil when she heard young people use the word. She's had it used against her in a lot of harmful different ways when she was younger. And so we didn't use the word queer in that space because it wasn't affirming to everyone in the room. Slurs that are reclaimed are kind of tricky like that. They can be very powerful for those who are reclaiming, for those who are in that community. They can also still be harmful to those in that community, and for each person to decide themselves and for us to honor and respect that as best we can moving through space is important. So I won't use it largely in presentations and things because I don't know what folks' relationship to that slur will be in the space. It's not a totally LGBTQ only space, those sorts of reasons. So you may not hear it used a ton in spaces like this, but when you're talking with young people, when you're talking with families, community groups, you may hear the word used a lot by those within the community, and it can be a really powerful word for those folks. So yes, you'll hear it in different contexts, not so much spaces like this, perhaps. So yeah, age is part of intersectionality, right? We need to be considering the lived experiences and the things folks have gone through at different points in time. And we're trying to create spaces, right, where folks can be their full selves. Mark's adding in the chat, should we use it at all to be safe? Certainly if someone tells you, hey, my name's Lydia, I use they, them, I'm a queer person, we want to be matching language, right? So if a young person uses the word to describe them, any person uses the word to describe them, yes, absolutely appropriate to use that word to describe them. I would say that's the kindest thing, right? To reflect that language and honor the words that they've chosen to describe their experiences. In a group or on flyers, it can be, on marketing materials, it can be tricky. If the organization is not in the community, if it's not an LGBTQ run and serving organization, likely do not use the word. LGBTQ plus would be good. You certainly, if folks are using it, like if you're in a youth group space and those young people have agreed to use the word, that's an appropriate place to use the word to describe the community. It is a little bit of a gray area, and it is a little bit tricky to learn to navigate what words do you use to talk about yourself so I can honor that. And then remember that sometimes these words have meaning that can harm still, and that it's still a powerful thing. Absolutely. So the answer is situation by situation, but always reflecting those folks, their language and their identities back at them. When we learn what words they use, we can reflect that. So one other way that YMCI really helped us think about intersectional perspectives and experiences was we had these phenomenal focus groups and conversations, and we invited a graphic illustrator. I don't know if any of you have ever been in these groups yet, where there's someone, instead of taking notes, like drawing on the board as you're talking. It's a very cool way to learn and sort of participate in a group. But this is one of the images that came out of their conversation around peer support and what sort of needs to be happening, right? And this was a group of LGBTQ and or BIPOC young people. And so things such as existence is evidence. The very fact that I am here as a young person of color who's also LGBTQ means that these lived experiences exist and that we have specific needs and considerations, and we need to be addressing them. We have a series of these images. They're all, I think, pretty powerful and really beautiful. And this can be one way, right, that maybe we have this up in our office, right, to demonstrate like, this is some place that we're getting some of our resources. This could be like one of those secret handshakes, right? Especially for those CPS or youth peer providers or young adults of color who are also LGBTQ. To see both of their identities honored in the same materials or in the same conversation, same spaces, can be really powerful because that's not always the case for them. The Youth Move Change Initiative is online. And so all of the resources and things that are coming out of this group's phenomenal work are available at the link in the chat. I'm going to go through a couple of them that you may be more interested in as you're learning sort of this curve. The first is that there is a series of recorded coaching and professional development opportunities, and they cover the topics on the screen, but certainly our peer spaces from LGBTQ youth who are also of color, really saying that like these are the specific considerations. This is what happens in the overlap. We have work here specific to Native young people as well as Latino and Latinx communities, really thinking about what does that lived experience look like. Thanks so much, Daniel. Take care. What does that lived experience look like and how is it different than maybe most of the resources or stories that are out there that we're hearing? How can we really hone in on these particular young people's experiences and support them in our work? So the link is youthmovenational.org/Youth Move Change Initiative or YMCI coaching. These are available online. Certainly, if you've hired youth peer providers, parent peer providers, you yourself, your colleagues in the organization can access these and listen in as a way to kind of to expand that knowledge. The other things that are online include What Helps, What Harms tip sheets. What Helps, What Harms is a conversation model where it is peer-led and there's 3 questions. The first is what's helping, what's harming, and what's needed. You can do this around education, around your own organization services. You can do this around schools, whatever sort of topic area young people are talking about or anyone's talking about. And then out of these conversations with the YMCI folks, we have 2 tip sheets, transgender and non-binary youth, and then for youth who are BIPOC as well as LGBTQ and Two-Spirit. And so these sort of tips are directly from young people with this lived experience, and they can be super valuable in hearing, again, directly from the young people who are in these margins. They're telling us what they need. They're very vocal about it. We need to really pause, listen, and check out our own foundations and our own habits and cultures within our organizations and work and see what we can shift to make them more open for others. Our first scenario is you are about to interview a young person named Sam for a youth peer specialist position. Group 2, you're a clinician, you're about to meet a new family referred to services. And group 3, you and a colleague are youth project leads with a youth group. And while you're out sick, a staff member, a colleague of yours covers, and when you come back, there are some concerns from the young people in that group. And so we want to ask you to assign a note taker and someone who will report out when you come back to the larger space, and tell us how you thought through these scenarios and what things did you consider? What questions did you ask yourselves? What resources or information did you need? All right. So whomever's helping me out with breakout rooms, feel free to open them up, or maybe they're already open. Thank you. So for group 1, who is preparing to interview Sam, what were some of the things you had to ask yourselves or consider before moving forward with the interview or in the interview?
Hi, I volunteered to report
Thank you.
out. But this by any means is not everything that was said. One of the things we wanted to be is sensitive to the surroundings, or not to be non-judgmental, and to be inviting, to also ask to introduce ourselves with our pronouns and offer them the opportunity to introduce themselves. So we will not assume what they want to be, their name, and, just to be respectful, to be kind, considerate, to listen to their story, and to be able to have the room to be as inviting and not as threatening as possible. It's another word, but it's escaping me. And to treat them with you know, authenticity and kindness, and let them tell their story.
Absolutely.
And you know, invite them to do the job because they're more than qualified to do it. Thank you.
Absolutely. I really love this piece about inviting them in. And it also sounds like your group's thinking about like, how do we model the culture of this workplace and show, not just say that we are accepting or affirming, right? How can we demonstrate that, like, yeah, we want you and your lived experience here, whatever that may be, right? Let's hear it. Let's talk about you know, this role, but certainly modeling, big part of that. Thank you so much. Yeah, the showing and telling is really great. How about for group 2? Your clinician about to meet a new family referred to your organization. What were some of the things you had to ask yourselves or consider as you were preparing for this meeting?
So I'm gonna go ahead and
thank you.
share some of the stuff from our group. So we had lots of questions about this one, and some things after we come up with some ideas, actually more questions come out. So
that's often how these go. Yeah.
Yeah, and first in reading it, we automatically just kind of assume, so the child welfare social worker was referred a family for the first time, and they had concerns about the parent passing on their problematic lifestyle choices. So automatically we just assumed that this child welfare, child social worker was like the parents somehow were LGBTQ of some sort. And of course we thought that was very inconsiderate that they would say that.
Yeah.
And so that was our original thought. So I'll go through that first. So first of all, we would, as the clinician in preparing for the meeting, we would want to gather more information. So we talked about contacting the social worker, asking why they would say that, you know, what their thoughts were, and if that was said to the parents, because then we were concerned of how the parents felt, and how that would affect their family as a whole, because I'm not sure if the welfare social worker, you know, I don't know we didn't know what all their involvement was, other than that being a concern. And just asking if that was said to the family, and then if so, also like what other expectations as a social worker, like what is it that they're wanting us to work on, like what are they wanting to get out of that, and then contacting the family too, especially if something like that was said to the family, how it made them feel, and providing a safe space and letting them know that, you know, we were going to provide that, and advocate for them and support, and introduce ourselves with you know, our pronouns, and ask their preferred pronouns, and just creating a safe space, because if that was the case, then, you know, that wasn't a safe, wouldn't be a safe feeling for them.
Right.
And then as we talked further, then we were like, well, what if the idea of the problematic lifestyle choices, I don't know, we may have been thinking about this too much. Maybe it was the opposite of what we were thinking. Maybe the child was LGBTQ and the parents' lifestyle, in terms of maybe their religion or their beliefs or something like that, actually was the concern of the social worker, and how that could be affecting the child. So we went
absolutely
both ways.
No, and this is great, right? Because that's what we want to do when we're thinking like what might be happening here, right? What curiosities can I go in with, you know, open mind, open heart, to just understand this experience. I really appreciate you considering that if this was said directly to the family, right, like that trust may be broken. How can we begin to repair that, begin to heal that before they even step foot in the office or into Zoom with us, and demonstrate that we are here to support. The other thing that I like to note in this scenario in particular is that things like lifestyle problems, et cetera, these can also be the result of EHR, electronic health records. So if you get your files through digital means, many medical providers, for example, will list sexuality under problems on the in like the portal for patients. So for example, my doctor listed problems, like listed my gender and sexuality under problems in my EHR. And I was like, those aren't problems, those are just things about me. But how might that make someone feel, you know, a young person or their parents feel for their identity to be labeled a problem? And are there, again, this is an example of examining our policies, practices, technology we're using. Is there a field, right, to put that answer correctly so that that doesn't happen? Thank you so much. There's so much to consider in that one. I appreciate you. I know we're running a little bit over. There is a feedback form in the chat if you would be willing to click through to the Survey Monkey and fill that out. But I would also love to hear from group 3 about how you addressed your colleague who covered the youth group for you, and about and when they used they didn't use the young person's chosen name and split the group by girls and boys. How did you approach this colleague to colleague conversation?
So I want to piggyback on first, if
Yes.
it's okay, what you were just talking about the electronic health record, which actually came up in our group conversation that at my agency, we have a crisis stabilization unit for youth, and we'll have kids come in who identify with a different name or different pronoun than they're given one, and that we haven't, once their parents have left, we have a conversation with them about how do you want to be documented in your record, because your parents could have access to that record, and we don't want to out you by putting the wrong pronoun or the wrong name. So we want to call you the right thing, but how do you want us to document that?
Right, and this is such an important part, explaining to the young person, it's not that we don't want to support you, we want to keep you safe, and the EHR is a computer, it's a robot, there's only so much flexibility it can give us, right?
Yes. Explaining
the full context and saying, but we will use your correct name and your correct pronouns. Super important. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So in terms of our situation, we just talked about talking with this group member about what happened, and that it's not person-centered, it's not appropriate to call someone by the wrong name, or just being able to talk through like the insensitivity of that, and sharing some of the information like from your presentation, and just providing some general education, but then also even having a conversation about like processing why was there a need to split the kids up between boys and girls? Like, was that even appropriate? And did you let them choose which group they wanted to be in, and just things like that?
Absolutely. So it certainly sounds like you're coming into this not assuming that there's any maliciousness, just possibly they did not know, right? And here's why we try to know ahead of time, and we want to be sensitive to this. And do we have to split the, sometimes that's the only thing we can think of to split people up by is gender, but maybe once we offer alternatives like favorite foods or colors or whatever, can we have alternatives set up for next time, and how can that trust be rebuilt? Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I know we're over. In your slides, you'll have these sweet little cartoons. And next Affinity group is coming up. I'm going to hand it back over to Michelle. I'm happy to hang out for a few moments if folks have further questions. I'm going to hand it over to Michelle to kind of wrap up for the sake of the recording. And thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to drop a few more resources in the chat, but I'll make sure that folks have them so they can email them out to you as well.
Yes, thank you very much. And if you all have any additional questions, Lydia at youthmovenational.org. Next Affinity group is going to be May 4th. We will have CEUs available for that next one. So make sure to register. We hope to see you there, and thank you all for your time.